Okay, so what we want to talk about is Git. Probably a few of you, who's worked with Git before? A couple of you have. You tried? Well, Visual Studio makes it really easy. There's a lot of different ways. So what Git is version control. What do we mean by version control? Why is it important?
You're working with a team of people, and just like you can keep it updated, and then if you make an error or something, you don't lose any.
Right, so version control is basically a way of archiving our code, so as we're making changes and building a project, if we overwrite our own changes, or when we make a new addition, we break our old code, we basically have a code archive where we can go back to previous versions. And as Kaylee said, this also makes it much easier when we're working with other people, that we have basically, everybody can have a local copy of the code, we can have a master copy of the code, and we have the ability to sync changes. Either we want to pull changes from the master copy so that we get a fresh copy, or we've made changes to the code and we want to add our changes to the master version of the application. So Git's been around for a long time. It's based on Linux. And originally, basically, Git was just something you use through the command line. And a lot of people still use it through the command line. And you issue commands for creating new versions, for pulling copies, for syncing copies with other users. They now have clients that have where you don't have to use the command line anymore. So there is a Mac build, there is a Windows version. One of the nice things is we really don't actually need any of these if we have Visual Studio, because Microsoft has integrated the ability to work with source control and work with Git right in Visual Studio. So the most common place to basically to host your Git, they're called repositories. Basically, a repository is like an archive, a code archive. The most common place is here on github.com. Now, I haven't used this a lot in school previously, but actually one of the recommendations that I've heard over and over again from employers is, if you want me to hire your students, they better know how to use GitHub, because all of our code is there, and you really shouldn't be graduating anybody who doesn't know how to use GitHub or some other version of a source control system. They all work in similar manner, but this is probably the most popular archiving mechanism around. And when we work on, you've probably noticed many times when you find plugins or code samples, developers tend to post them here to GitHub. And in fact, when we're working next January, when we're working with Node.js, many of the packages and widgets and plugins we use, the developers host them on GitHub. Okay? So the first thing you need to do in order to use GitHub is everybody needs to have a GitHub account. So if you already have a GitHub account, that's fine. If you don't have one, you need to go to github.com and you need to create an account for yourself. It's free. They do have paid versions. You don't need a paid version. A free version will suffice.
Actually, it seems like all the employers I talk to, for them, your Git repository, what you have posted on Git is more important than your resume, because they actually look at what you're doing. Because they're like, show me your Git, show me your Git. Okay.
Absolutely. When we had a web advisory meeting a few weeks ago, we heard that feedback. Not only do they want to see that you have a portfolio site, but those were the two things they want to see exactly. They said, I care more than the resume. I want to get 2 links from someone hunting for a job. Where's their portfolio, and what have they put on GitHub? Because they can actually see your code. Okay, so we heard that repeatedly. Okay, so I'm forcing you guys to create a GitHub account. There are other ones. There's another popular one is called Bitbucket. It's quite common. GitHub is the most popular one. So I want you to create an account right now for yourself, if you haven't already.
So
It's a cat.
Can GitHub
Like
use
Hello
as
Kitty
a
is a
portfolio?
person.
It's like, I know a lot of times it's like people just want like a bunch of projects and you just like say, here's my GitHub.
You could, but I would probably host the portfolio separately. One of the other things they said is they don't want to particularly see your portfolio running on the school server. They want to see that you actually know how to buy a domain name and host a domain name, for $10 a year. Part of that was, many of the employers said they want to know that you should own yourname.com and that your portfolio is hosted there, was the suggestion. Obviously, we can't require you to spend money on it, but the feedback we're getting from employers is that's a really good idea. That you have brandonelliott.com or .ca and your portfolios are running there.
Okay.
Would be a really good idea.
So basically, is GitHub like Dropbox where you can share files with people and you can see it?
I'll show you. So what I'm going to do from now on, I'm no longer going to post the solution files to Blackboard at the end of every week. I'm going to post them to GitHub. And I will give you the GitHub link. And if you want my solution, you can just pull a copy from Git and open it in Visual Studio. So I've been doing this with the programmer students. So here's my GitHub account. I'll show you several things about how this works. So they use the word repository. So a repository is like one application. So for example, for my Wednesday class, here's my solution. Here is my Visual Studio solution from Wednesday. And in here are the files we made. So here are the ASPX files. You can actually see the raw code right on GitHub. You don't have to download it. You can see it online. So here was one of my ASPX files. Actually, that wasn't the one we were working on. Here's the C# file. So here was all the C# code we wrote in class. So you can see every individual file. So rather than me zipping and uploading to Blackboard, from now on, I'm going to create a new repository at the end of every class. I'll call it COMP2084, lesson 5 today, lesson 6 next week, and I'll just push all the code to GitHub. Okay, and then so I'll put the link on Blackboard instead, and you can just download the code that way. So these are my repositories. In terms of working with somebody else, so one of the other computer studies faculty, we're just building out this little application. He wanted to learn ASP.NET MVC. So we've been building out this application. He's been doing most of the work. So it says there's 2 contributors. We can both send changes to GitHub. But we also, you can see here, there's been 40 commits. So a commit is basically an upload from your local code to GitHub. So 40 times we've got this archive, and every time you make a new commit, you have to put in a comment. So if I want to go back, let's say we break something and we want to go back to a previous version, we can just go into the commits, we can find any version, each one gets a unique ID, and we can take any version that's here. So it's this whole online archiving system basically that's free. Now, whatever you put on GitHub is public by default. If you want, you have 2 options. If you want to store stuff on GitHub, work with somebody else, but you want it to be private. And I guess I should have mentioned this before you created your account. If you say you're a student, I believe they give you up to 5 private repositories. If you pay, you also can get additional private repositories. So all of my stuff on GitHub is public. I don't really care that this is out there. Everybody has access to it. That's fine.
Bitbucket gets you free repositories. Free private.
Bitbucket gives you free private. So you can use Bitbucket. The nice thing about using GitHub is it's already integrated into Visual Studio. So we don't have to use the command line or install the Git client for Windows or Mac in order to push our code to GitHub or to download. We can do it right through Visual Studio. Just one sec. Visual Studio also has their own version called Visual Studio Online or Team, where you can sync and do a similar thing, but we're going to use Git because it's more commonly used and it's used. It would be a good idea to get familiar with the commands anyway, because you can use this. This is not an ASP.NET thing. This is for doing any kind of code development. So we're going to use GitHub when we do Node.js. You can use GitHub with PHP. In that case, you either need to use the command line or you need to use the Windows or Mac visual tool. Here's what the Windows tool looks like. So you can still download and install the Windows or Mac client.
Security, if I have like a PHP thing or something like that with all of my database connection information on it, that's just thrown up there for everyone to see.
You should ignore your file.
Oh, you can ignore certain files?
Yes.
Okay.
So here's the Git. So basically I can have local code repositories. I can also connect to remote code repositories and download them. So if Carlin's put a repository on Git and he wants to share it with me, all I need is the link, and I can add it through Git and it will sync. Basically, I'll be able to download a local copy of that code. So in that case, I would be using the clone feature, where I could clone from another repository and I would download and I'd have my own local copy that I could work with. So this is the Windows client. So for example, here's one of my students in the Wednesday class. So I can just clone his application. So now also when you guys are submitting files to me after this assignment, you'll no longer have to upload the files to Blackboard. Once we get them hosted in the cloud, you can just give me the hosting link and you can give me the GitHub link to your code. Okay, so I can get all of his stuff. So you can see here he was committing and making comments as he goes. So if we want certain files, we want to upload the project, but we want to ignore certain files, there is a git ignore command where we can say to ignore certain folders or certain files. So basically leave these out of the sync process. So I've put on Blackboard in our lesson 5 kind of a simple tip sheet with most of the basic commands. But again, we don't even really need to issue these commands. These are the kinds of things we do from the command line. So init creates a new repository. Ignore will let us leave certain files out of the sync. So push is basically an upload. So at the end of each class, I'll create a new repository. I'll use Visual Studio to push or upload those changes to GitHub. And I'll put the link on Blackboard. So cloning is what I just did. That's doing the reverse, taking an existing code repository from GitHub and downloading a local copy that you can play with. Well, it's the command prompt.
Does it write the same as the other one? Is it just?
Yeah, so the initial version was command line only. You would issue these commands through the command line. There's also such thing as branches, which is a bit advanced. We won't get into branches, really. But notice here, we put all of our commits to a master branch. We have the ability to make other branches of our code. So let's say we have a production branch, a staging branch, and a development branch. So we can take the code and make basically a separate version that we can play around with that doesn't necessarily sync back, and one person or one developer is in charge of the master. We're not really going to get into different branches, usually just working with the master branch, which is the default. That'll be enough for our purposes. But it has this kind of more advanced functionality. Let's say we were working in a really big team with a lot of people doing different parts. You know, we could have a front-end branch, a back-end branch, a client branch, etc. And then somebody could be responsible for merging all of those. So it's quite a powerful tool. That means we don't lose our changes. We can easily work with other people and sync. We can share our code online. It does an awful lot of stuff, and we're basically going to use GitHub moving forward. Okay. You don't have to use it for your assignment, for assignment 1, because we don't have hosting set up. I'm just waiting for a few more Azure passes. For assignment 2, you will need to post your stuff to Git, and for the labs, the rest of the labs we do moving forward, you can post them to Git as well. Okay. So we'll play around, we'll look at how this works. So what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through the process. We're going to take our solution that we've written today in Visual Studio. So we're going to take this little solution we have running, and we're going to deploy it. We're going to create an empty repository on GitHub, and then we're going to push this code so it all exists on GitHub. Okay? Okay. We can do it all through Visual Studio. There's really no code involved. It's just kind of clicking, going through a wizard. So the first thing we want to do, once you're logged into GitHub, the first thing you want to do is you just click on the plus sign here, and we want to create a new repository. So I'm going to call it COMP2084 Lesson 5. And you can also put in a description of what this code repository is. So I'll put in a description of what our little sample site we built. Excuse me. We have the option to add a git ignore file if we know there's files we want to exclude. And normally, if we were using the Git client, typically people would create a simple README file. Once we have that README file, it allows us to clone the repository either through the command prompt or the Git client. We don't need this if we're using Visual Studio. We're not even going to bother with the README. So I'm just going to click Create. So it doesn't matter if you have the same name as me, because the repository address includes your GitHub username. So IFOTN is my GitHub username. So it creates an empty repository, and it will actually show us here how many people have pulled a copy from it. We can also set up our own wiki if we want to make a description. So users will do this people will do this if you want to put up a code library for other people to use. You know, we do this with Node.js. We'll download packages and widgets, and in the wiki, the developer will put in documentation about how their code works. So for now, we've got this blank repository. So what we want to do, you can either copy that line to the clipboard and choose copy, or you can just click this little button here. So there's the URL for where our code repository will be. github.com/your username / the name of your repository.git. So we'll click on copy. And we'll go back to Visual Studio. And I'm going to go to my Solution Explorer. I'm going to click on my solution right at the very top. I'm going to right-click it, and there's an option here that says Add Solution to Source Control. Now, I don't know if you have a little wizard. You might have a wizard saying, do you want to use Visual Studio Online or GitHub? What does the message say? Choose Git. And if you have the option to say, remember this in the future, you won't get that prompt again. It'll just use Git moving forward from now on.
What's the top one?
It's basically a Microsoft version of source control. So you notice when I created it says a new Git repository has been created for me. So I now have a local repository, which would be blank. So if I go into my Lesson 5 folder, if I open up today and Lesson 5, it now created this .git folder with these two .git files. So these are just, basically the way GitHub works is it watches for changes. So you can set it up if you want to automatically sync to GitHub. We're going to manually sync it. So to manually sync it, you might have this window here that says Team Explorer. If you don't have it, you can get the Team Explorer through the View menu. So just click View, and Team Explorer is right near the top. So go to Team Explorer. And I think you should get a window that looks like this on Team Explorer. Does yours look like this, or does it look different? Okay. So if we click on Changes, oh, sorry, you have to enter your GitHub login here. If you go to Settings, and Git settings, you need to put in your GitHub username, and it will probably prompt you for your password. So once you've put in your username, and I think it will prompt you for your password, and click update. It'll set up a default location for the repository, that's fine. You can change that if you like. That's where it goes by default. Your username /user/source/repos. Did you get prompted for your password or not yet? Were you able to click the update button?
No, just a username and the email address.
Okay, that's fine. It will prompt us for our Git password at some point, I believe. Okay. So once that's in there, if you just click the back button, sorry, we want to click the home button. I'm sorry. So click on home, and then we'll click on changes. So here are all of the files that our local version has that our live repository online doesn't have, because our repository online is blank. But our local repository includes all of the files that we've built today. So up here, before we can commit, we always have to put in a message. Every commit has to have a description. So I'll say first commit to GitHub. And once I've put in some description here, notice my commit button becomes enabled. And if I click this drop down and choose commit and push, we're almost done. We should be able to do one more thing. So click the drop down once you have a message, click commit and push, and we're going to get this message. There's no remote repository configured. Publish this repository to share commits. So basically what it's asking is, where is the remote repository on GitHub? Where are we sending this stuff to? So right here, there's a box that says publish to remote repository. Enter the URL of an empty Git repo. That's where we paste our link, right? We copied that link from our GitHub page. If you don't have it on your clipboard, just go back to GitHub and just click the link right here. Click copy right here. That'll copy your repository link. So we paste that into the publish to remote repository and click publish. It says the origin has been added and the current branch has been published. So I'll close that. Now if I go back to GitHub and refresh my repository here, it says I have 2 commits, I have 1 branch. It gives me a commit ID. It says it was synced a minute ago. And here's all of the code. So our master page is here. And our default. So all the code has now been pushed to GitHub. How far did you get? So I know how far to go back in the instructions.
Pretty much when I open Teams.
Click on Settings, Git Settings, and enter your credentials. And then click Update.
Why do they prompt us for an email address?
I don't know the answer to that.
It's like for harvesting.
Your email harvesting. Get ready for focus.
Once you've put your settings in, click the Update button, and then click the Home button. Then click on Changes. Enter a commit message, doesn't matter what it is. and click the commit and push option. Notice if I try and commit again, commit's disabled. Anybody have an idea why was commit disabled? I've committed, I pushed. Kaylee? Right, because it recognizes it's watching for changes. Because I haven't changed anything in the file, I can't make another commit. In order to do this, I have to save something, even if I just put a space in the code and hit save. Now I can go back.
Just make the ninth edition of the textbook right there.
Now commit's enabled. So now I could commit a second one. So Matt, choose commit and push. And then it will say you have to enter the URL to a remote repository. That's when you paste in. So now I've pushed again. So you have to paste in the URL to your Git repository. So now if I go back to GitHub, I should have 2 commits. Actually, I've got 3. So now my second was just published 12 seconds ago. So I can still go back to the first version. I can pull up either version of the code. Okay, so I will never lose it. Git is archiving it for me.
Is there any kind of like auto-save?
You may be able to set this so that it will auto-sync as soon as you make changes, but you probably don't want to do that. Every time you hit save, you probably don't want to push the whole thing to Git.
No, but like a timer, like every like 10 minutes or every hour or whatever.
That is a good, very good question. I don't know the answer to that. If we go into settings.
Why not daily use? It's not hours.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Save to your local
Yeah, so you don't have to push to GitHub every time, because it keeps the local versions of the repositories on your own machine. So GitHub is watching for changes. That part happens automatically. It's the manually syncing to GitHub.
Would you be able to show us how to do it not through Visual Studio? I don't know, like,
Well, so you can either do it through the command prompt, so you can do it through here. So if I go and open up, so here's my repository in the Git client. Sorry, I don't want to clone. See, I don't like this client very much.
the guy tried to do it like last week with the Mac client too, and it said that I uploaded everything, but then nothing ever showed up.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of this client. Like I have no simple way to get back. Like that will open it on GitHub. I don't want to create a new one. I just want to open. I mean, you can use the command prompt, but the Visual Studio, it's so easy to do it that way through Visual Studio. Like there's no option to, oh.
Like even just adding any.
File source. Yeah, you can do it. So if I open one, so I can click add and browse to the repository, and then I can click sync. So I'm 4 versions behind, but I haven't actually made changes. This will actually download from GitHub, download changes to mine, rather than the opposite, rather than pushing. If you don't want to, I don't find the client is great. You're better off, if you don't want to use Visual Studio, basically your better choice is to use the command line.
I just think, like, for something that we don't do in Visual Studio, right, like how you would upload that, like just maybe something from that we did last semester, right, like that's not through Visual Studio.
You know what? You could still do it through Visual Studio. So I could do this. So if I opened a website, so I have, you know, what we did last term. Let me just open one.
Maybe assignment 1.
I haven't tried doing this, but I could probably still do it through here.
What about adding files via like the web browser? Is there any way to do it?
Sorry?
Is there any way to add it via the web browser? There.
To upload straight from GitHub, no, it's not done. You can download. So for example, now if you want my copy of, let's say you want my copy of the solution for today, I've put it on Git. So I'll just put this link on Blackboard. So all you have to do, you can either download the zip file or you can clone it into a local repository, and that will take a copy and make a local version, a local repository, if you click clone. So let's see if yeah, I could add to source control. No, it's because they're in different folders. Oh, I think I've got to change something. You know what, Kaylee, I'll try to come up with a step-by-step to put on Blackboard or for us to go through next week. Does everybody, have you been able to create a repository and push your code to GitHub? So what I'll do for this week is all I'm going to do is I'll just grab that URL. And now rather than uploading the files directly to Blackboard, I'm just going to give you the link. So you can either download the zip from GitHub, or you can actually try cloning it and getting a local repository that way, either way.
Put the code in this repository search to find your file.
No, if you want to find my file, so all you do, this is just a link, just open it as a link.
Oh, okay.
It'll take you straight here. So you also don't have to download a copy if you don't want to, but if you want to see something, the code is just here straight on GitHub, so you can go into the solution and you can open up any file and you could actually just view the code online if you want to. If you don't want to. If you don't want to be downloading all the code, you could do it that way. You can actually see each individual file this way. And it shows you a commit history on every page. So I know this is new. It's actually pretty straightforward to use. And it's something I've probably been remiss in the past in not forcing students to use. So I'm not making that mistake with you guys. So when you go out on co-op, when you're writing resumes, you're going to say, yes, I know what source control is. yes, I've used GitHub, and I'm familiar with that, because there's a good chance when you're out working that your employer is going to want to make sure we already know how to use this. I have a couple minutes left. Batya, you had asked about just a quick review of the calculator we had done in class a few weeks ago, right? It was our tip calculator, because you're basically doing similar things here with the game calculator.
How do we get the average?
Okay, so you'll have to calculate the average. So what will you need? How will you generate that? What calculation would you need to get the average number of spectators? So each game has, yeah, so you'll have to sum those 4 values together, right? So the total number of spectators, and then how are you going to get the average from that? If it's, yeah, you'll just divide that number by 4, right? So the average is going to be the total divided by 4.
How would you write that?
Okay, well, you'll have to, in your C#, where's my solution? We wrote calculations in the tip calculator. So here, we did it for calculating the tip, we wrote a mathematical formula, right? We took the amount of the bill, we converted it to a decimal number, and then we multiplied it by the amount of the tip. And we stored that in a variable. So you'll need to, first you'll need to calculate the total of the attendance, so you'll need spectator 1 plus spectator 2 plus spectator 3 plus spectator 4, and that'll give you a value. You'll then need to take that value and divide it by 4 to get the average. Okay? And this solution, so this is the lesson 3 solution. This code is on Blackboard. In fact, in my GitHub, I'll put a link to my GitHub. If you go into the repositories, I actually have the tip calculator code. Similar, it's basically, I did this in my Wednesday class, it's the same code. So it's actually on GitHub as well. If you just go back to my main GitHub page, so it's just github.com/my-username, you're free to browse any of the repositories that I put on here. And if you want to see what we're going to be doing, any of them that say Wednesday, the Wednesday class is about a week and a half ahead of this class. So you can actually look, you can watch any of those lessons on YouTube and browse any of the source code that's on GitHub if you want to see what we're going to be doing in a week or 2. It's all there. Okay? So I'll just put a link to my general GitHub page. I'll put this on Blackboard as well. So in course documents. So here's my Git page, and you can just go into any repository. If I put it on GitHub, it's because you're free to look at it.
So we're still doing like the convert to decimal?
Yes, you'll have to do that for sure. In fact, well, you won't need decimals. Here we needed decimals because we had dollars and cents. For this one, there's no, we're only dealing in whole numbers, except the percentage could be a decimal, right? If I win 2 and lose 2, the percentage will be 0.5. So you'll need a decimal there because it might not be a whole number. But these ones are going to be whole numbers. And the average you can round. Doesn't have to be a decimal number for the average attendance. You could just show the nearest whole number. That's fine.
It says convert to decimals, so
There's 2 INT 32 is an integer, 32-bit integer.